Picture this. You stand in the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle, Scotland, December 9th, 1542 AD. The air is thick with frankincense and something darker, the metallic scent of fresh blood seeping through floorboards from the chamber above. Candlelight flickers across stone walls that have witnessed coronations and murders in equal measure, but never anything like this. A baby wails, sharp and piercing, cutting through the murmured Latin prayers of bishops who cannot meet each other's eyes. The sound echoes off vaulted ceilings as if the castle itself is crying out against what it's being forced to witness. 6 days old. That's how long Mary Stuart has been alive when they place the crown of Scotland on a cushion beside her head. She cannot lift that head without support, cannot focus her newborn eyes on the ancient symbol of power that will define and destroy every moment of her existence. Her tiny fists curl and uncurl reflexively as holy oil is dabbed on her forehead by trembling priestly fingers. Her mother, Mary of Guise, watches from a chair, still bleeding from childbirth, her face pale as the December snow falling outside. She holds herself upright through sheer will, because to collapse now would be to admit that everything has already collapsed. Her husband, King James V, lies dying in his chambers at Falkland Palace, 30 miles away. He turned his face to the wall 3 days ago when they told him his newborn child was female, and has refused food and speech ever since. The humiliation of military defeat at English hands has broken something inside him that cannot be mended. It came with a lass, he whispers to no one, speaking of the Scottish crown that his ancestor Marjorie Bruce brought to the Stuart line through marriage, and it will go with a lass. Then he dies, leaving his week-old daughter as Queen of Scotland. In this moment, in this chapel that smells of blood and incense, and the sweat of anxious nobles, you can almost hear the future arriving like distant thunder. The whispers have already begun in the dark corners, carried on breath that fogs in the December cold. She'll never survive. Too many enemies, too many threats. But if she does survive, God help us all, she'll be the death of kings. Outside the chapel, Scottish nobles sharpen their ambitions like daggers. In England, King Henry VIII plots to seize her through marriage to his sickly son. In France, the royal court watches with calculating interest. This baby, too young to understand the weight of silk swaddling, has just become the most valuable political prisoner in Europe, and no one yet knows how much she will suffer before they finally kill her. Before we witness her tragic descent, like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Isn't it strange how across 5 centuries, we're still bound by the story of a baby who wore a crown before she could walk? Scotland didn't just fracture when James V died, it shattered. Within weeks of the coronation, the kingdom dissolved into civil war masked as political maneuvering. Every noble house, every ambitious lord, every man with an army and a grievance saw the same thing when they looked at the infant queen. Opportunity wrapped in silk and lace. The Earl of Arran declared himself regent and Lord Protector, claiming authority through blood proximity to the throne. The Earl of Lennox challenged him immediately, raising troops and calling Arran a heretic and a usurper. The church split between reformers who wanted Scotland to break with Rome, and traditionalists who saw Protestant influence as English poison. Mary of Guise fought to maintain control of her own daughter, but she was French, Catholic, and female, which meant she was trusted by almost no one. The baby, at the center of this chaos, remained oblivious in her nursery at Stirling Castle, surrounded by guards whose loyalty shifted with political winds. Her existence became both shield and target. Nobles invoked her name to justify their ambitions while simultaneously plotting to control or eliminate her. She was simultaneously the most powerful person in Scotland and the most vulnerable. King Henry VIII of England saw the chaos and smiled. His solution was characteristically brutal and simple: force Scotland to agree to a marriage between infant Mary and his 5-year-old son Edward, thereby annexing Scotland through matrimony rather than conquest. The Treaties of Greenwich was signed when Mary was 6 months old, promising her hand to the English prince. But Scotland's nobility had not survived centuries of English aggression by keeping their promises. Within months, the Scottish Parliament repudiated the treaties, refusing to hand their queen to the English like a diplomatic gift basket. Henry's response was equally predictable. If he couldn't have Scotland through marriage, he'd take it through fire. The rough wooing began in 1544, a military campaign with the gentlest name for the most savage violence. English armies swept across the Scottish borders, burning towns and abbeys, slaughtering civilians and soldiers alike. Edinburgh was sacked. Holyrood Palace was torched. The goal was simple: terrorize Scotland into surrender and deliver the baby queen to English custody. Mary was moved constantly, smuggled between castles in the dead of night like contraband. At 2 years old, she learned to sleep through the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the urgent whispers of guards, the terror in her mother's voice when scouts reported English troops approaching. Her childhood became a series of fortified rooms and hasty escapes, each move designed to keep her alive for one more day. The kidnapping attempts were constant and creative. English agents bribed servants, forged letters, posed as merchants and pilgrims. One plot involved drugging the guards and smuggling Mary out in a baker's cart. Another planned to ambush her convoy on the road to Stirling. Each failed attempt made the next more desperate, more violent. By the time Mary turned 5, Mary of Guise had made the only choice that offered any hope of survival: France. The old alliance between Scotland and France was ancient and reliable, and the French king needed Scotland as a strategic counter to English power. A marriage contract was signed. 5-year-old Mary Stuart would be betrothed to Francis, the Dauphin of France, and raised at the French court until the wedding could take place. In August 1548, as English armies burned their way through southern Scotland, Mary was smuggled to Dumbarton Castle on the west coast. She was dressed as a peasant girl, her distinctive red-gold hair hidden beneath a rough wool cap. She didn't understand where she was going or why. She only knew that her mother was crying as she kissed her goodbye. The ship that carried her to France departed on a gray morning when the fog was thick enough to hide movements from English patrols. Mary stood at the rail, too young to understand that she was leaving Scotland forever, that she wouldn't see her mother again for 13 years, that she was being shipped across the sea like a royal package to secure an alliance that might not even survive the decade. She was 5 years old. Already she had survived more assassination attempts than she had birthdays, and France was waiting. The court of France, in 1548, was the most sophisticated, most cultured, most magnificently excessive royal household in Europe. Compared to the drafty stone fortresses of Scotland, the French chateaux were palaces from fairy tales, all soaring ceilings and intricate tapestries and gardens that stretched to the horizon. Mary arrived speaking only Scots and Latin. Within 6 months, she was fluent in French. Within a year, she was composing poetry in it. King Henry II and Queen Catherine de' Medici embraced Mary as if she were their own daughter, possibly because she was everything their actual children were not. She was tall, graceful, unusually beautiful with distinctive auburn hair and amber eyes. She learned quickly, spoke eloquently, played the lute and virginals with real skill. She could dance for hours without tiring, ride horses like a cavalier, and debate theology with visiting scholars. The French court adored her. They called her the most perfect child and dressed her in silk gowns that cost more than a Scottish castle. At state functions, she would sit beside the Queen, a living symbol of the Auld Alliance, smiling with practiced grace at ambassadors and nobles who bowed before her as if she were already Queen of France as well as Scotland. But beneath the glittering surface, Mary was still a prisoner, a gilded prisoner, certainly, a beloved prisoner, but a prisoner nonetheless. Every moment of her day was scheduled, supervised, recorded. She woke when courtiers decided, she ate what was served, she wore what was selected, she smiled when required. Her education was designed not to prepare her for independence but for obedience. She learned to be charming, decorative, religiously devout, and politically useful. The marriage to Francis was arranged before she arrived, and preparations began immediately. Francis was her age, small and sickly, prone to frequent illnesses and infections that left him bedridden for weeks. He adored Mary with the desperate attachment of a weak child clinging to someone strong. She was kind to him, gentle, protective even, but there was no passion, no partnership, just a rehearsed affection that everyone pretended was love. They married in April 1558, when both were 15 years old. The wedding at Notre Dame Cathedral was the most lavish ceremony Paris had seen in decades. Mary wore a white dress studded with precious stones, a crown so heavy she needed help keeping her head upright during the 6-hour ceremony. The wedding feast lasted 3 days. Poets composed verses comparing her to Helen of Troy, to Aphrodite, to the Virgin Mary herself. 6 months later, Mary Tudor of England died without an heir, and the succession crisis everyone had anticipated finally arrived. Mary Stuart was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through her grandmother Margaret Tudor. Her claim to the English throne was legitimate, Catholic, and supported by France and much of Catholic Europe. The English Parliament chose differently. They crowned Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom Catholics considered illegitimate. Henry II of France was furious. He declared Mary Queen of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, and had her coat of arms quartered to include English lions. Mary, raised to be obedient, signed the documents she was told to sign and accepted the titles she was told to accept. It was political theater, and everyone knew it, but it was also a declaration of war that would follow Mary for the rest of her life. Elizabeth would never forgive the presumption, and Mary, too young and too sheltered to understand the consequences, had just made an enemy who would eventually kill her. Then, in December 1560, Francis II, King of France, died from an infection that started as an ear abscess. He was 16 years old. He and Mary had been married for 17 months. Mary was suddenly widow, no longer Queen of France, and increasingly unwelcome at a court that no longer needed her. Francis's younger brother Charles became king, and their mother, Catherine de' Medici, made it clear through silent gestures and cold protocol that Mary's presence was no longer convenient. At 18 years old, Mary had to return to Scotland, to a country she hadn't seen since she was 5, to a kingdom torn apart by religious reformation, to subjects who remembered her as a French puppet and distrusted everything she represented. She stood at the rail of the ship carrying her back across the channel, watching France disappear into the fog, and wept. Not for Francis, who she'd cared for but never loved, not even for the life of luxury she was leaving behind. She wept because for the first time in her life, she would have to rule, alone, surrounded by men who thought her soft, foreign, Catholic, and female, and they were already sharpening their knives. Scotland in 1561 was unrecognizable from the kingdom Mary had left 13 years earlier. The Reformation had swept through like wildfire, and John Knox, the Protestant preacher, held more real power than any noble. He called the Mass idolatry, and the Catholic Church the synagogue of Satan. He had written pamphlets declaring that women were unfit to rule, that female authority was monstrous and against God's natural order. Mary arrived in Edinburgh to fog so thick the ships nearly ran aground, and Knox declared it was God's judgment on a Catholic queen returning to a Protestant nation. The city that greeted her was gray, cold, and hostile. No pageantry, no celebrations, just suspicious faces and whispered prayers in languages she'd forgotten. She was 19 years old, widowed, and inheriting a kingdom that didn't want her. But Mary tried. She tried. She promised religious tolerance, agreed not to impose Catholicism on her Protestant subjects, attended Protestant services even while maintaining private Catholic Mass. She appointed Protestant advisors, listened to counsel, made concessions that would have been unthinkable in Catholic France. Knox still called her Jezebel from his pulpit and prophesied her destruction. For 4 years, Mary governed reasonably well, all things considered. She balanced competing factions, maintained relative peace, and even managed to charm some of her initially hostile subjects. She was tall, charismatic, genuinely interested in governance. Foreign ambassadors reported that she was intelligent and capable, far more so than her reputation suggested. But Elizabeth still refused to name her as heir to the English throne, and Mary needed a husband, needed an alliance, needed to produce an heir of her own to secure the succession. The question of whom she would marry consumed European politics. She chose Lord Darnley, and everything went to hell. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was handsome in the way that conceals rot beneath polished surfaces. Tall, well-built, golden-haired, and charming when he wanted to be. He was also Mary's first cousin, a Catholic with a distant claim to both the Scottish and English thrones. On paper, he was perfect. The marriage strengthened bloodline claims and pleased Catholic factions while not being overtly hostile to Protestants. They married in July 1565. By autumn, Mary understood her mistake. Darnley was vicious, stupid, and incapable of understanding any authority beyond his own appetites. He demanded to be named King of Scotland, not merely Prince Consort, and raged when refused. He drank constantly, disappeared for days to brothels and taverns, and returned reeking of wine and violence. He struck Mary during arguments, called her a whore in front of courtiers, and undermined every political decision she made. Worst of all, He was consumed by jealous paranoia. He fixated on David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary, a musician of humble origins who had become one of her most trusted advisors. Darnley convinced himself that Rizzio was Mary's lover, that the child Mary was carrying might not be his own, that the entire court was laughing at him. On the night of March 9th, 1566, Darnley and a group of Protestant lords burst into Mary's private chambers at Holyrood Palace, where she was having supper with Rizzio and a handful of ladies in waiting. Mary was 6 months pregnant. The men grabbed Rizzio, who screamed and clung to Mary's skirts as they dragged him away. They stabbed him 56 times in the adjoining chamber, while Mary listened to his screams. Blood pooled beneath the door and seeped into the royal apartments. Darnley held Mary back while his co-conspirators murdered the man she'd been laughing with moments before. Rizzio's corpse was left in a heap at the top of the stairs, a message written in blood and violence. This is what happens to those who get too close to the Queen. Mary nearly miscarried from the trauma. She didn't. 3 months later, in a chamber that still smelled of blood no matter how much it was scrubbed, she gave birth to a son. James Charles Stuart, future King James VI of Scotland and first of England, entered the world screaming in a palace that had become a slaughterhouse. Mary's relationship with Darnley was over, completely, irrevocably finished. She couldn't divorce him without bastardizing her son, couldn't publicly accuse him without triggering civil war, couldn't live with him without risking her own murder. So she did nothing, and everyone at court watched the marriage rot like a corpse left in summer heat. Then, on the night of February 9th, 1567, the house where Darnley was recovering from smallpox exploded. The blast was heard across Edinburgh. When guards reached the scene, they found Darnley's body in the garden, strangled, not killed by the explosion at all, but murdered and placed there afterward. The whispers started immediately. Mary must have known. Mary must have ordered it. Mary was seen with James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man most suspected of orchestrating the murder. Mary looked relieved at the funeral. 3 months later, as spring broke over Scotland like a curse, Bothwell allegedly abducted Mary while she traveled from Stirling to Edinburgh. He took her to Dunbar Castle, and what happened there remains one of history's most debated questions. Did he force himself on her? Did she consent? Was the entire abduction staged to provide cover for a marriage that was already planned? 10 days after the alleged abduction, Mary married Bothwell. She wore black instead of white. The Protestant ceremony lasted 15 minutes. No celebration, no feast, just a grim exchange of vows that sealed her fate. Protestant lords exploded in rage. Catholic nobles felt betrayed. The people of Edinburgh rioted, screaming, "Adulteress" and "Murderess," as Mary tried to appear in public. Placards appeared across the city depicting Mary as a mermaid, the symbol of prostitution, and Bothwell as a hare, Darnley's family emblem, dripping blood. Within a month, armies marched against the Queen. Not foreign invaders, but her own nobles, her own subjects, her own countrymen who had decided she was unfit to rule. They met at Carberry Hill on June 15th, 1567. Mary rode out to negotiate, still believing she could reason with men she'd governed for 6 years. They demanded she abandon Bothwell. She refused. They called her whore. She wept. Bothwell fled. He would die mad and imprisoned in Denmark years later, having destroyed Mary and saved himself. Mary was taken to Lochleven Castle and imprisoned. On July 24th, 1567, nobles arrived with documents for her to sign. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son James. Her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, would serve as regent. She was 24 years old. She had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old. Now she was prisoner, forced to watch as they took her crown and gave it to her baby, who didn't understand the weight of the gold they placed beside his head. In the tower room at Lochleven, Mary miscarried Bothwell's twin sons, dead before they drew breath. She hemorrhaged for days, nearly died, and no one came except the servant who cleaned away the blood. But Mary Stuart had survived worse, and she wasn't finished yet. Mary escaped Lochleven Castle in May 1568, climbing out a window with the help of a young page who fell in love with the romance of rescuing a captive queen. She rode through the night, rallied an army of loyalists, and within days had 6,000 men ready to fight for her restoration. They met Moray's forces at Langside. The battle lasted 45 minutes. Mary's army was crushed. She fled south on horseback, riding 90 miles in 3 days with only a handful of loyal companions. She crossed the border into England on May 16, 1568, believing that her cousin Elizabeth would offer sanctuary and help her reclaim her throne. She was 25 years old and about to make the last mistake of her life. Elizabeth didn't help. Elizabeth imprisoned her. To be fair, Elizabeth was trapped by impossible politics. Mary was Catholic, legitimate heir to the English throne, and a rallying symbol for every Catholic conspiracy in Europe. To release her back to Scotland would be to restart civil war. To execute her without trial would be to murder an anointed queen, which set a precedent no monarch wanted. To help her reclaim her throne would be to install a Catholic rival on the northern border. So Elizabeth did nothing, and nothing became 19 years. Mary was moved between castles and manor houses, each one more remote and more restrictive than the last. Sheffield Castle, Tutbury Castle, Chartley Manor, places with stone walls and limited windows and guards who watched her every movement. She was allowed servants, books, needlework, but no freedom, no autonomy. The years ground her down slowly. Her health deteriorated from the damp English climate and lack of exercise. She developed rheumatism that made walking painful. Her hair turned gray prematurely. She lost teeth from scurvy and poor diet. The beautiful French princess who once danced at Fontainebleau became a middle-aged woman whose body was failing in captivity, but her mind stayed sharp, too sharp. Mary wrote letters, hundreds of letters, thousands of letters, to foreign courts and Catholic sympathizers and English nobles who might be convinced to support her cause. She wrote in code, smuggled messages in beer barrels and laundry baskets, maintained correspondence networks that stretched across Europe. She never stopped believing she could regain her freedom. Some letters were innocent pleas for release. Others discussed possible rescue attempts. A few, perhaps, mentioned more direct solutions to the Elizabeth problem. English spies intercepted them all. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, cultivated a network of informants and codebreakers that made privacy impossible. Every letter Mary sent was read, copied, analyzed for evidence of treason. Walsingham was patient. He understood that eventually Mary would write something that could justify her execution. Meanwhile, Catholic conspiracies bloomed around Mary's name, whether she participated or not. The Ridolfi plot in 1571 planned to assassinate Elizabeth and install Mary with Spanish support. The Throckmorton plot in 1583 planned the same with French backing. The Parry plot in 1585 involved an attempted stabbing. Mary claimed ignorance of most of these schemes. She probably was ignorant of most of them, since Walsingham's agents were often the ones inventing the plots to begin with, using agent provocateurs to entrap Catholic conspirators. But perception mattered more than reality, and each failed conspiracy made Mary's continued existence more politically untenable. She still signed her letters, "Your most faithful cousin and loving sister," as if 2 decades of imprisonment were a misunderstanding that could be resolved with proper protocol. Elizabeth never responded. Not once in 19 years did Elizabeth reply directly to Mary's letters. The English queen maintained the fiction that Mary was a guest, not a prisoner, that the confinement was for Mary's own protection, that release was always being considered but never quite possible. By 1586, Mary was 43 years old, prematurely aged, chronically ill, and increasingly desperate. When Anthony Babington approached her household with a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and liberate Mary through armed invasion, she listened. When letters arrived written in cipher describing the plan, she responded. When asked if she approved of Elizabeth's assassination, she wrote, "Yes." Walsingham's agents decoded every word. They had what they needed. Mary was arrested in August 1586 while riding in the grounds of Chartley Manor, one of her few permitted pleasures. She was moved to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, a grim fortress specifically chosen for its isolation and its association with English justice. The trial was predetermined. 24 commissioners examined the intercepted letters, the decoded messages, the testimony of Babington before he was hanged. Mary was not allowed legal counsel, was not permitted to see the evidence against her, and was tried under a law specifically passed to make assisting plots against Elizabeth a capital offense. She defended herself with dignity and intelligence, arguing that she was an anointed queen not subject to English law, that the letters might have been forged, that she'd been provoked by years of unjust imprisonment. Guilty of treason. Sentence of death. Elizabeth hesitated. For 3 months, she refused to sign the death warrant, understanding the precedent it would set. Executing an anointed queen, even a foreign one, violated every principle of divine right monarchy. Kings and queens were supposed to be immune from earthly justice, answerable only to God. But her council insisted. Parliament demanded it. The people called for Mary's blood, terrified of Catholic plots and Spanish invasion. And Elizabeth, finally, signed. The execution was set for 8 in the morning, February 8th, 1587. Mary spent her final night in prayer, writing letters to friends and relatives that she knew would never arrive, organizing her few belongings to be distributed among her servants. She didn't sleep. There was no point in sleeping before eternity. At 6 in the morning, the Earl of Kent and the Earl of Shrewsbury arrived to escort her to the great hall where the scaffold had been erected. They found her dressed entirely in black, her mourning clothes modified for the occasion. Beneath the black, she wore a bodice and petticoat of deep crimson, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She walked steadily despite the rheumatism, refusing assistance, her head held high. Her little dog, a Skye Terrier she'd kept throughout her imprisonment, tried to follow her. Servants held it back, and its whining echoed through the stone corridors. The great hall at Fotheringhay had been hung with black cloth for the occasion. The scaffold was raised 2 feet off the floor, draped in black, with a wooden block covered in black velvet. 300 witnesses packed the hall, nobles and officials who had traveled to watch history occur. The smell of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat filled the air, despite the February cold. Mary climbed the steps without trembling. She listened to the death warrant being read aloud, her expression calm, almost peaceful. When asked if she had anything to say, she spoke clearly. She forgave her executioners. She prayed for England and for Elizabeth. She proclaimed her Catholic faith and her innocence of crimes against the English throne. She stated that she was dying for her religion, that her blood would wash away whatever sins she'd committed in life. Her servants helped remove her black gown, revealing the crimson beneath. The witnesses gasped. The symbolism was unmistakable, deliberately provocative. She was presenting herself as a martyr, as a Catholic saint dying for her faith. She knelt at the block, still composed. Her ladies wept openly, but Mary showed no tears. She positioned her head carefully, making sure her neck was properly placed. She recited Latin prayers in a steady voice. The executioner raised the axe. The first blow struck the back of her head instead of her neck, making a gash but not severing anything. Mary's lips moved silently, still, praying. Witnesses later testified that they could hear her whisper "Sweet Jesus" in the moment between blows. The second blow cut most of the way through her neck, but didn't sever it completely. Her body convulsed, legs kicking against the scaffold floor. The third blow finished the job. Her head separated from her body and rolled across the black velvet draping. The executioner reached down to hold up the head by its hair. As was traditional, it came away in his hand, leaving him holding an empty hairpiece, while the head, revealed to be completely gray beneath, fell back onto the scaffold with a wet thump. Then something moved beneath Mary's skirts. Her little dog, which had somehow followed her into the hall and hidden beneath her clothing during the execution, emerged covered in her blood. It sat beside her corpse, howling, refusing to be moved, refusing to leave her even in death. The witnesses didn't cheer. Many wept. Even the Protestant officials who had demanded her death seemed shaken by what they'd witnessed. There was something too deliberate about Mary's performance, too theatrical about her martyrdom. She'd turned her execution into a Catholic passion play, and everyone present understood the message she was sending. Her lips continued to move for 15 minutes after decapitation. Muscular spasms, the doctors later explained. Involuntary nerve impulses, meaning nothing. But the Catholic witnesses swore she was still praying, that her faith was so strong it persisted beyond death itself. Her body was left on the scaffold for hours, while officials argued about what to do with it. Eventually, it was wrapped in black cloth and buried in Peterborough Cathedral with minimal ceremony. Her servants were forbidden from collecting relics or taking keepsakes that might become objects of Catholic veneration. Elizabeth claimed she never intended for the execution to proceed, that the death warrant had been issued without her knowledge, that she was grief-stricken by her cousin's death. She wore mourning clothes and refused to appear in public for weeks. No one believed her. Everyone understood the performance. In Scotland, Mary's son James, now King James VI, protested weakly and accepted increased English subsidies as compensation for his mother's execution. He had been raised Protestant, barely remembered Mary, and was far more interested in positioning himself as Elizabeth's heir than in avenging his mother's death. In Catholic Europe, Mary became an instant martyr. Pamphlets appeared depicting her as a saint with a halo, dying for the true faith against Protestant heresy. Pope Sixtus V declared her a martyr of the Church. Philip II of Spain used her execution as partial justification for launching the Spanish Armada the following year. The dog was finally coaxed away from Mary's body. It died a few days later, refusing food, pining for its mistress. Servants buried it quietly in the castle grounds. 25 years after Mary's execution, her Protestant son James became King of England when Elizabeth died without an heir. The irony would have made Mary laugh. Everything Elizabeth had feared came to pass anyway. A Scottish monarch inherited the English throne. A Catholic son ruled Protestant England. The Tudor dynasty ended, and the Stuart dynasty began. One of James's first acts as King of England was to have his mother's body exhumed from Peterborough Cathedral and reburied in Westminster Abbey, the traditional resting place of English monarchs. He commissioned an elaborate marble tomb, far grander than Elizabeth's, with a marble effigy depicting Mary as young and beautiful, eternally preserved before imprisonment and execution aged her. The tomb lies directly across from Elizabeth's. The two queens, who spent their lives as rivals, rest in the same building, separated by a nave, but bound together in death, as they were bound in life. But only one of them died clean. Elizabeth died in her bed at 69, having ruled England for 44 years, having transformed her kingdom into a Protestant power that would dominate world affairs for centuries. She died surrounded by courtiers and servants, her succession secured, her legacy established. History remembers her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, one of the greatest monarchs England ever produced. Mary died on a scaffold at 44, having spent more than half her life imprisoned, having lost 2 kingdoms and achieved nothing she set out to accomplish. History remembers her as tragic, beautiful, foolish, romantic, doomed. But here's what history often forgets. Mary Stuart was crowned at 6 days old. She never chose this, never asked for the weight of that crown, never volunteered to be the symbol, the pawn, the excuse for other people's ambitions and conflicts. They shipped her to France at 5 because Scotland was too dangerous. They married her off at 15 because France needed the alliance. They sent her back to Scotland at 18 because France no longer wanted her. They imprisoned her at 24 because she'd made the wrong enemies. At no point in her life did Mary Stuart have actual freedom. Not as a child, not as a queen, not even in the moment of her death. She was always someone else's tool, someone else's problem, someone else's justification for violence and betrayal. She made mistakes. God knows she made terrible choices. Darnley was a disaster. Bothwell was worse. The letters to Babington were inexcusably stupid, even if you believe she was provoked into writing them. But she was also a woman trying to survive in a world that gave women exactly 2 acceptable roles: decorative wife or sainted virgin. Mary tried to be a ruler, a political actor, a person with agency and authority. And for that presumption, history has judged her more harshly than it ever judged male monarchs, who made far worse decisions and caused far more suffering. Her story ends in Westminster Abbey, in that magnificent tomb, with that beautiful marble face frozen in eternal youth. Tourists photograph it every day, standing in the same building where Elizabeth's plainer monument sits across the way. The two queens, finally at peace, or at least at rest. But if you stand in Westminster Abbey when it's nearly empty, when the crowds have thinned and the afternoon light slants through the stained glass, you can almost hear it. A baby crying, a girl laughing in French gardens, a woman screaming as her secretary is murdered, a queen proclaiming her faith as an axe falls, a little dog howling for its mistress. Mary Stuart was a queen at 6 days old, but they never let her be a child, or a woman, or even a person. Only a symbol, a pawn, a crown without a head to properly wear it. And symbols, as history teaches us again and again, bleed differently than people. They bleed for centuries. They stain everything they touch, and they never, ever wash clean. And if you stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel and watch this video next about the most inbred man in European history.